Thank you so much, Diane, and Vince for leading us in this journey, this class. We're so looking forward to beginning it today and going through November 8th at 1 o'clock. We'll meet Sundays at 1 and try to get started shortly after 1 when coffee hour lets out. And Diane and Vince, for those of you that don't know, and are a wonderful archivist at Riverside, and we're so grateful to you both for leading us through this journey. Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you. So I think, Bruce, do you want to just quickly go over the small group covenant? Do I need to unshare my screen for you to do that?
That's great. I can share it on mine, or I can just read it, whatever is easiest.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay, there you go.
Hi, everyone. Great to see your faces. Okay, I'm going to share my screen real fast, and this just will go through our covenant for our first class as we meet. So I'm Bruce Lamb, the Minister of Faith Formation, and part of our small group classes, we would just like to let you know about our covenant for this journey, and I'll read it to you and we'll go through it together. It's real fast. Because we value our time together and because we value and affirm the positive values and contributions of a diversity of people, including people of different ethnicities, cultures, genders, sexual orientations, ages, and abilities represented among us, we members of this small group agree to enter this space with curiosity and humility, to leave behind cell phones and other distractions and mute and turn them off. Video, if an outside matter, absolutely must be dealt with during class. To value and respect privacy and therefore keep personal information confidential, sharing ideas outside the group only without attribution. To encourage all questions, comments, and responses, and to allow all to contribute. To recognize that we are here to work on ourselves, not on others. To expect moments of discomfort, even with high emotion, including racial stress. And that was actually left in from the Race to Action small group class, but you never know, it could arise here. So to be brief as possible in our comments, to allow for sharing time equitably. One acronym we like to use is WAIT, why am I talking? So we want to make sure and have every voice heard, and we'll utilize the chat and the raise hand feature to make sure we can recognize people. And also I like to always bring up too, if you're joining us from on the phone, please, we want to make sure your voice is heard as well. So please just jump in. I wish there was a raise hand feature for on the phone. So please know that we see you and want to hear you. You are valued. To be an intentional and listening actively, not interrupting others or engaging in crosstalk, and making space for each other. To honor the opinions of others we disagree with as valid and sincere, allowing for honesty and safety. To speak personally and use I statements. To treat others with respect, caring, and kindness as we seek to find truth and common ground. To avoid repeating ourselves as a way of monopolizing and controlling the conversation, and to keep discussion on topic and seek to develop a sense of community. That is our small group covenant. If we just all say, yes, you agree, and we're so glad that you're with us as we want to create a safe, welcoming space for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Can you all see that? Am I back on? Yep, okay, cool. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Bruce. Again, I just want to say I'm Diane Russo. I'm the director of the Riverside Church Archives. I've been here for about 2 years, actually. In November, it's going to be 2 years. Vince, do you want to unmute yourself for a second and just introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Vince Kelly. I'm now the archivist at the Riverside Church. I've been here for about a little over 1.5 years, I think.
Mm-hmm. And Vince has been working on a special grant project, which will be one of the course, one of the later classes, a topic. It's really amazing. And we've digitized a lot of audio from the 60s and 70s, and that's been his sort of baby project. But now he's going to be working on other things, so yay.
I'm
I'm
excited.
happy that he's now officially our archivist. Okay, so I just want to briefly, I don't have the syllabus on the screen, but I just want to briefly go over it and go over like a few kind of intro housekeeping sort of rules, not rules, but so this is the History of Riverside 90-year small group class. This is in honor of the 90th anniversary, which is October 5th, 1930. Again, Vince and I will be co-teaching the class, but we'll also have some experts within Riverside coming in and either teaching, co-teaching, or bringing their expertise in some form or another. We really wanted to make this class comprehensive and not just be Vince and I speaking about the history, but engaging everyone at Riverside. Initially, we had planned this course for the spring, and it was to be in person. And so we had this whole awesome format set up, but obviously with the circumstances, we weren't able to do that. And we postponed it, hoping that maybe this fall we'd be able to meet in person, but of course that's not possible. So we've adjusted the class. Again, it was intended to be in person, and so we were going to bring archival materials for you all to engage with and touch and read and look at and discuss, but we've kind of had to move that into a virtual space. So what I've done is have a PowerPoint, and everything in this PowerPoint is from our archive. So everything here is primary sources from the Riverside Church archives. So we want to share as much of the archive as we can. And what I've done is each week we have like a set of primary sources that we will email you or make available to you ahead of time. They're not mandatory, but it'd be great if you can like take a look at them, and those could be a point for discussion, sort of like close examination of these materials and discussion. That's hopefully a way that we can get that sort of engagement back that we had planned for the in-person, but unfortunately can't do that, via Zoom. So I'll just read very briefly the general course description that I have on the syllabus. This class will delve into the Riverside Church's rich history and archival materials. In honor of its 90th anniversary, it will be a survey-style course discussing key points throughout the past 90 years, with each class centered around a specific theme. The course will utilize archival materials to tell Riverside's history and bring its history to life, with an emphasis on key materials for deeper examination and discussion. You'll see on the syllabus, I have two resources for course materials. There is no required course material for you to read. This is try not to give homework or anything like that, but I feel as though you're probably very familiar with these sources anyway. It's the first one is the History of the Riverside Church in the City of New York. It's the Peter J. Paris book, available, I think, at the gift shop and just generally anywhere. It's very accessible. And then the Riverside Church in the City of New York, that's the book with the blue cover. Again, that's available at the gift shop, and it's been widely distributed in many different ways. That has a lot of good archival images and a lot about the art and architecture. So that's just a good one to peruse. But I will also be giving you a bibliography for each. It will include each of the themes that we talk about, and it'll be more resources. So you can use this bibliography at your leisure to delve into any particular topics that you find really intrigue you. And they will be a mixed bag. So there'll be archival resources that we have in our archive and may be difficult to get elsewhere. And so we can chat about how we get those available to you. I've already scanned and digitized some of these resources, so I will make them available electronically to you. Still trying to figure out, probably through email, but there might be a sort of portal where you can go and download all of these things. So I'm trying to scan as much as possible to make available to you, for you to look through at your leisure. Thank you, Carol White. She says, by the way, the Paris history is available in Kindle format. Thank you. And then the other sources on the bibliography will be things that you can get on Amazon or Kindle or at your local library. So this is just to, give you a group of resources for you to delve in further if you would like. I thought it'd be somewhat helpful. Now I'll just very briefly go over the course schedule. So technically we're 8 weeks, but it's 9 on the syllabus for a specific reason. But this week we'll delve into the intro of Riverside, Fosdick, and Rockefeller. Week 2 is October 4th. There will not be a class, and that is because that's when we're celebrating the 90th anniversary. There will be a lot of festivities, via Zoom, an extended coffee hour, a lot of fun things going on, and we don't want to take away from that or kind of compete with that. So I encourage you all to attend those sessions. So that'll be on the 4th. Week 3, we'll go over the art and architecture of the Riverside Church. Week 4, we'll delve into Riverside's pulpit and we'll discuss notable sermons from the senior ministers. Week 5, we will go through social justice and action, Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights, as well as William Sloane Coffin and the disarmament program. Week 6, we'll talk about the media at Riverside, WR, VR, and beyond. This is the one I mentioned that Vince has been working on that particular project. Week 7, we'll do famous events and visitors at Riverside. Week 8, Riverside's community. And week 9, we'll delve into Riverside's hidden histories and highlights from the archival collection. That one is intended to be just sort of a fun course to share with you stories that we couldn't fit in any of the other themes, but really wanted to share with you anyway. They're really cool and unknown, and just sort of a catch-all class for, again, anything we couldn't fit elsewhere. So the way the course is via Zoom is I'll have this PowerPoint, but I do want to encourage questions and discussion and engagement. This is the first time I'm kind of leading a course via Zoom. So I think we can use, as Bruce said, there's like the chat feature, there's raising hands. If I don't see that, just interrupt me as I'm speaking and just say, excuse me, and you can ask the question. And especially if you're on the phone, feel free to just delve in and get my attention that way. We'll see how it goes with this format. Just please bear with me. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about any of that, sort of the logistics of the course? Nope, doesn't seem like it. Okay, so we'll just dive right into the content then. So Riverside's history, although we're celebrating 90 years, it actually begins on February 13th, 1841 at the Norfolk Street Baptist Church. So the founding congregation of this church consisted of 364 people who were former members of the Stanton Street Baptist Church. So we have this group, the Stanton Street Baptist Church, and half of them decide that they want to split and create another church. And actually, the person that goes along with him is the pastor, George A. Benedict. He's shown here. You can see his image here. So the Norfolk Street Baptist Church was actually incorporated in 1841, and this is actually still our original articles of incorporation. I actually got an archival request from one of our staff members that we need the Articles of Incorporation. And I had to look in the archive, and I was trying to find for Riverside, but it's actually the Norfolk Street Baptist Church, because technically since this congregation was incorporated, we've only changed our name multiple times. But this is truly the founding of our church. So in 1848, Benedict completed his ministry, and Dr. Thomas B. Armitage became the new pastor. You can see him here. He had the misfortune of beginning his ministry without a church structure, because the building that they were worshiping in on the corner of Norfolk and Broome Streets was actually destroyed by fire in 1848. So the year that he began, it was destroyed by fire. The fire was said to have been caused by coals from a charcoal furnace igniting the roof during repairs. So a new building was built between Broome and Grand Streets and was dedicated in 1850. And that's the one that you see here in this image. It was a brownstone built in the Gothic style with square towers on the east side of Norfolk Street. This is an interesting tidbit. You might be wondering, like, why I'm including this. It's interesting because our congregation has actually had a very unlucky history with fires, which we'll delve into a little bit later. But it's also something that's very prominent in churches. I know a few years ago, Notre Dame, we'll delve into why, but it's, throughout history, many cities have actually burned because of the wooden structures. So we're part of that unlucky history, unfortunately. But anyway, they've got this new church. And by the 1850s, New York at this time was greatly expanding, which led many people, including those in the congregation, to move uptown. So this was the time where immigrants are flooding in from Europe, German, Irish, English, and they're coming to New York. And so it becomes clear that the church actually needed to move uptown along with its congregants. So they buy 5 lots of land on the south corner of 5th Avenue and 46th Street in 1859. And the new building was erected. And the church was renamed the 5th Avenue Baptist Church. And so this is the first renaming of our congregation. During this period in the 40s, New York City was actually considered suburban. Upper Manhattan was really farmland and summer homes. So by moving into this neighborhood, the church started to attract people of higher means, meaning wealthy people, because the further up you went during this period, the wealthier the folks living there were. For a very long time, New York City was considered everything like below 14th Street. So this is Riverside is growing as New York City is growing as well during this period. During the Civil War, the 5th Avenue Baptist Church fell on really difficult times because many of its congregants experienced bankruptcy, but also a lot of the young men died in the battlefields fighting for the Union. Interestingly enough, Dr. Armitage, the pastor, was himself almost a victim of the war in the 1863 New York City draft riots. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but opposing the draft has a very rich history in the United States. So these riots were infamous for the violence and destruction that was wreaked upon Manhattan by predominantly white working class. They were protesting congressional laws that were drafting the men into the Civil War. So this was, New York City was like on fire for a brief time. And apparently Armitage kind of got caught in the crossfire. He was on his way to a train that was headed to Westchester when he encountered rioters with weapons, and he was almost killed. But luckily, somebody in the mob recognized him as a pastor, and he was spared at the last minute. The next day, however, his house was targeted since he was listed he was called out in a list of Union sympathizers. So the story goes that a mob went to go get him at his house. but an official of a church went to the head of the mob and sort of redirected them away from him. So he was spared a second time. And merely because he was a pastor. So he was able to survive this horrific time for that reason. And because he was well known, it seems that he was recognized, and that just shows how our church, our congregation, was predominant in this era. So due to the financial difficulties that the congregation was going through, we actually lost 3 lots of land that we held on Fifth Avenue. But in 1864, we acquired 2 other lots next to 46th Street. So this meant that we no longer resided on Fifth Avenue, but we still retained the name. We retained the name anyway, we didn't change it. And the new building was dedicated on June 8th, 1865. It was during this time, right after the Civil War, that the Rockefeller family became involved in the church, which many of you know is a relationship that lasted well into the 20th century and even continues in some form today. The origin story begins really with William Rockefeller, who you can see on the left. He was a young businessman from Cleveland, and then the brother of John D. Rockefeller Senior, and he moved to New York, became a member of the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. He suggested the church organize a sinking fund. I don't know anything about finances, but this is what the resources tell me. A sinking fund, which he would manage to get the congregation out of debt and out of its financial difficulties. Our sources say that they were originally $50,000 in debt. Again, I don't know finances. I'm not an economist, so I can't tell you what that means in today's money, but I can imagine it was a lot. 50,000 in the post 1860s. So they were in a lot of debt, and he managed to get them out. In 1878, they were debt free with his help. So this is pretty significant, and it's interesting to note because this sort of becomes a running theme in Riverside's early history. The Rockefellers are consistently contributing to building our church and funding our programs, as well as helping our church out of debt and whenever there's a deficit. So in the early years throughout the Board of Trustee minutes, you can see that for a year we don't have operational budget or we're in a deficit, and Rockefeller, one of the Rockefeller families, just gives us a check and it's like, here's the money to cover that. And so we were very blessed in the early years to have this this financial backing, and it's a theme that goes on throughout our history. So Rockefeller Senior, you can see he's on the right. He began attending the church in the 1880s. So this is, again, William Rockefeller's brother. And although he always retained his membership at his church, his hometown church in Cleveland, he actually served as the president of our Board of Trustees, again, at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. And his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was also a member and would later contribute to building Riverside. He was integral he's the Rockefeller we're sort of most interested in. You can see here, these are just some examples of our collection of Rockefeller memorabilia. We have John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s hymn books. You can see they're sort of gilded with his name. And the reason we have this great Rockefeller collection is, again, because of this history and this founding nature of the Rockefellers. Okay, let's see. In 1888, Dr. Armitage resigned as pastor, and William Herbert Perry Faunce led the congregation in 1889. He was a pastor of liberal leanings, and it was during his ministry that the sectarianism of Armitage ministry fell away to more liberal thinking. And so this is when our church starts to become more liberal and more progressive. During his tenure, I don't know if anybody on here on this call belonged to the men's class at any point, but during his tenure, the Young Men's Bible Class was founded in 1894 by Charles Evan Hughes, who later became the Chief Justice of the United States. And it was later headed by John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1898. So this is actually, this is the beginning of what would be the Riverside's men class. And this is a photograph. It's actually panoramic, so it is much longer than this, but I just got a little snapshot. So it was a vibrant part of Riverside's, our predecessor church's community. So this is a really great panoramic photo. I don't know where Rockefeller is here. I'm sure he's here, but I haven't been able to pick him out. There are so many faces in this crowd, but one day we'll try to figure out which one he is. Okay. Also during this Pastor Fonce's time at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church, many of New York City's wealthy families became members of the congregation, and our membership really grew during this period. In 1891, the Armitage House on West 47th Street was founded, and there was a kindergarten and day nursery school conducted by the Women's Society that was formed, as well as a sewing school, a Sunday school, and a Boys and Girls Club. It was later replaced by the West Side Neighborhood House in 1898. And these programs are really early precursors to what would later be formed at the Riverside Church, and shows that the community at some points in our history was very integral to the church. So, you know, we have a Sunday school, we had a sewing school, a women's society, a kindergarten day nursery school, which is now our weekday school. We have all of these things now, and it just shows that this goes back to the 1800s. So that's pretty, community is pretty important in our church. So now just like a quick run through of some of the passages. You see a lot of these faces, but just going through them really quickly. In 1899, Fonce left to become the president of Brown University. In 1901, Dr. Rufus P. Johnston became the new minister. He's here on the left. His ministry was more of a personal one, and he did not continue to forward the work of Dr. Fonce within the community. Now, this is another early example of sometimes the focus and the ministries of the church depended on the senior minister in charge and of his vision. I say him because, as we know, until Amy Butler, in recent times, there were always men who were heading our church, always white men who headed the church. And it was really them who decided the focus. And so again, Dr. Johnston was very more of a pastoral, personal ministry. He resigned very shortly, however, in 1906, and Charles F. Aked, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, it's A-K-E-D. He became minister. You can see him on the right here. He was liberal and a brilliant preacher, and he really focused on setting aside denominational differences. So again, you can see these themes running through our early history. It's not as though Riverside in 1930 is created, we're interdenominational, we focus on community. This has been long-running themes throughout our history. So he really focused on trying to set aside these denominational differences. But he resigned very shortly after in 1911 due to frustrations with the church and its congregation. So what exactly that means, I'm not 100% sure. It just seems as though his focuses weren't really aligning at that time with the congregation. Again, remember this time our congregation was very large for that time period. So when he left, I heard did somebody want to say something? I heard a noise. No, it doesn't seem like it. Okay. Again, if you have any questions or want to discuss anything, just either tell me in the chat or just interrupt. Okay, so he was replaced by Cornelius Wolfkin in 1912. So Wolfkin was previously a professor of homiletics at Rochester Theological Seminary. He was born in New York City of German immigrant parents, and his father actually died in the Civil War. He's often cited as a case of sort of the American dream because he didn't have many opportunities for education and for opportunity for career growth when he was younger, given his immigrant status and his father passing away at an early age. But he was largely self-taught and extremely self-sufficient. After a brief stint as a sign painter, so he like literally painted signs, advertisements, things like that on trucks and etc. He became a superintendent of a Sunday school in Brooklyn. So his life is quite interesting. I'll put some resources in the bibliography about him. But eventually his life led him down the path of ministry. And at first he studied as a fundamentalist, which we'll get into in a little bit. But eventually he embraced liberalism, progressivism, and was even in later years called a heretic for his views. This is not the last minister of ours to be called a heretic, so we'll talk about that shortly. Oh, I see some things in the chat. Okay, so Carol Fokenpoyo, can you say a little bit more about the West Side Neighborhood House? Not now, later is fine. I'm not sure. I didn't delve into that. We can, if you have anything that you want to talk more about that, I can perhaps go back to my resources and delve into that a little bit more. I'm not really sure what you're interested in. Again, if you have more information, please feel free to enter in the chat or chat about it. And then Brad says, Johnson wanted the church to build a larger building. The members refused. I think he went to a church in San Francisco. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, anytime, Carol, anytime, Dan, I was just curious what it was. I can go back to my resources and get you a little bit more information on that. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. We can address that in the next class. Okay. So during this time, during Wolfkin's era, the church building's capacity and membership was outgrowing, and there was an increasing issue of urbanization. So again, we see that New York City is expanding, and our church expands with it. And so it was clear that in 1917, we needed to move uptown again. And so this time we moved to Park Avenue and 64th Street. Okay, so there's an image here. Because of an interruption caused by World War I, the congregation finally moved into the building post-war 1922. And again, we changed our name. We changed it to the Park Avenue Baptist Church. This is the third name change that we had. So again, throughout the years, we move uptown, we move to different buildings. Our congregation remains largely the same. We change our name, but our foundations go back to that church, Norfolk Street Baptist Church, in 1841. So this building was Gothic of granite, and it was 9 floors and a Carillon. You can see, I'm gonna try to do, I know that there's like a laser pointer here. Okay, can you see my little laser pointer? It's kind of cool. So the Carillon was built, and it was actually one of the earliest in America. And it was given in memory of Laura Spelman Rockefeller by her son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. So again, we see the Rockefellers contributing in many ways to the congregation. And at this time, the Park Avenue Baptist Church had a membership of about 800. So that's to give you an idea of the size of our congregation. During Wolfkin's ministry, there was a battle of fundamentalism versus modernism that was well underway in American Protestantism, which played a major role in the Park Avenue Baptist Church's future. So I'm not a theologian, so please bear with me as I attempt to explain this movement. I'm looking at it from a historical point of view. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, modernism developed in American Protestantism, particularly in light of new scientific research concerning the age of the earth and Darwin's theory of evolution. So biblical scholars and theologians began to call into question simple and literal readings of the Bible, and they began to study it critically while trying to take into account the new scientific theories. So they're really trying to square away the new developments with their faith. And this is something that really starts to be taught in seminary schools, and it becomes a big movement during this period. On the flip side, there's fundamentalism, which was a broad-based movement that reacted to these modernist trends in theology. And it's centered on the nature of biblical authority and doctrines arising from the reading of the scripture. So again, that literal reading of the Bible. So this evolved in the 1910s and the 1920s after a series of books were published. And that's actually where the name comes from, fundamentalists, from these series of books that outline 5 fundamentals that one had to believe in order to be a Christian. And those are 1, the inerrancy of the scripture; 2, the virgin birth; 3, substitutionary atonement; 4, miracle working power; and 5, the bodily resurrection of Christ and the second coming. And so this was sort of the crux of the debate between the fundamentalists and the liberals. The 2 denominations that were most affected by this movement historically were the Baptists and the Presbyterians, and this is where we see it play out and where it directly affects our history. Let's see, the Park Avenue Baptist Church minister Wolfgang, as we talked about, he was part of this fundamentalist versus modernist battle. So he had started his ministry in fundamentalist teachings, but again, moved to the liberal side, the modernist side. And he was involved in it, but to a much lesser degree than Harry Emerson Fosdick, who, as many of you know, was our first senior minister officially of the Riverside Church. At the time, he was a preaching minister at the First Presbyterian Church in New York, and he did that from 1918 to 1925. He was also a professor of practical theology at Union Theological Seminary. In 1925, Fosdick replaced him as the Park Avenue Baptist Church's senior minister. So Fosdick was a Northern Baptist minister, and he became integral in the fundamentalism versus modernist dilemma in 1922, when he preached the sermon, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" That was probably one of his most famous sermons. And this is what I gave you in the email as the primary source. So I hope you got a chance to read it. If you didn't, that's okay. So in the sermon, he advocated for tolerance on behalf of the conservative Christians. He warned that if they did not tolerate progressive Christianity, they would essentially die out. His bottom line was that while not all conservatives were fundamentalists, all fundamentalists were conservative and were at their core illiberal and intolerant. And after the sermon was published and disseminated, he got into a lot of trouble and he became part of a big controversy. The First Presbyterian Church where he was preaching actually made him choose between becoming a Presbyterian, remember he was Baptist, or leave their pulpit for good. In addition, they demanded he subscribe to a fixed historical creed like the Westminster Confession of Faith, and he refused to do that, so he left. This was a huge controversy. We have in our archive a lot of papers, a lot of archival documentation about this controversy. So it was a really big deal, and it directly affected the history of our church. because at that same time that this was going on, the Park Avenue Baptist Church was looking for a new minister. And John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was one of the lay leaders, again, he's been involved since the 1800s, he believed that Fosdick was the man for the job. Like Fosdick, he was interested in modernist ideas, and he believed that New York City needed a great Protestant cathedral. And so he even supported plans for the construction of St. John the Divine in trying to get this vision of a great Protestant cathedral. But Bishop Manning, who was in charge at the time, refused to allow him to join the board of the Episcopal Church because he was a Baptist. So Rockefeller looked elsewhere and decided to support Riverside's construction instead. So he approached Fosdick, and Fosdick declined, saying he would not conduct a ministry in a church that required baptism by immersion for full membership. So again, he's trying to get away from that very strict idea of what it means to be a Christian. After Rockefeller was sort of able to square that away with the Park Avenue Baptist Church, he approached Rockefeller again, who apparently refused once more because he didn't want to, quote, be a private chaplain to a small group of wealthy Manhattanites. So Rockefeller counter-offered by saying that they would build a new church in Morningside Heights, so that should alleviate Fosdick's concern because it would extend the congregation to those throughout New York City who were inspired by Fosdick's ministry. The story goes that Fosdick still said no, so he rejected Rockefeller a third time and said, quote, "You are too wealthy, and I do not want to be known as the pastor of the richest man in the country." So Rockefeller has said to have replied with, quote, "I like your frankness, but do you think that more people will criticize you on account of my wealth than will criticize me on account of your theology?" So it seems with this, Fosdick relented and decided to become the pastor. I haven't seen this in the primary sources. I've seen in a lot of secondary sources. This is where I'm getting the information from. I don't know, Brad, if you've seen this in primary sources, perhaps in Fosdick's papers, but this is the story. This is how the story goes, and it's been told multiple times. So I'm just relaying that to you here. Again, Fosdick refusing multiple times and then finally relenting. When he did decide to become the pastor, he had 3 conditions. The first being that affirmation of faith in Christ be the only requirement for membership and that baptism be optional. 2, he required that all Christians, regardless of denominational background, be freely admitted into membership, thus making us an interdenominational congregation, but still retaining the historical denominational affiliation with baptism. And 3rd, a new and larger building be erected for the expanding congregation and program. Okay, so Brad says, no, I haven't seen it in a primary source. So this is interesting. So again, I included it because the sort of quotes that of the conversation apparently held between Rockefeller and Fosdick. But that's one of the things about history is we have to see it in a primary source, and it could very well exist, and I just haven't seen it. And so history can be tricky this way. So you've got these things that have this lore about them, and you've got to try to find out where it originated. Somebody raised their hand. Yes, Penelope, yes.
Yes, it's in Fosdick's autobiography. He tells the story.
The story.
Exactly, yes.
Great.
Times approached, and what convinced him the 3rd time was not only this big church, but it would be a 7-day church, not a 1-day church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But exactly the words that you have.
Yeah.
What Fosdick said to Rockefeller and Rockefeller's response is recorded in his autobiography.
Great, thank you. Would you do me a favor and email me that autobiography? That would be great. I'm sure we have it in the archive, but if you can just email me the citation, that would be great.
The Living of These Days, and there's a chapter on Riverside, and I will put in the chat the exact page. Is that what
Great.
you'd like? Yes.
That would be perfect. And what I can do is I can scan that, digitize that chapter, and make it available to you also if you would like to read that. Thank you so much, Penelope. That's great. Okay. So we'll see where we were. Okay, so Fosdick decides that he is going to be our pastor based on those three conditions. We'll delve into his ministry a little bit later. Vince will kind of do a run through of that. But right now I'd like to talk about the actual building and construction of Riverside. And we're gonna start in 1926, which is when plans for building Riverside began. Again, Fosdick came to us in 1925, and so in 1926, plans started. Construction actually began in 1927, and it ended in 1930, 1931. So a building committee was created to oversee the construction, and John D. Rockefeller Jr. served as the chairman. Also serving on the building committee were Elmer E. Sanborn, William N. Crane, Dr. Eugene Carter, and as advisory members, Edward L. Ballard, who was the president of the trustees, and John B. Trevor. A committee of iconography was also appointed, headed by Rockefeller and Fosdick, and they decided the subject matter of the stonework, the stained glass windows, the sculpture, essentially all of the religious and thematic images that are throughout our church. So Riverside was actually funded by the accumulated properties of the Park Avenue Baptist Church and the donations of a few congregants, particularly John D. Rockefeller Jr. He actually bought the plots of land on which Riverside was built, and he contributed to building the tower and the Carillon, the latter of which was in memory of his mother, Laura Spellman Rockefeller, as it was in the previous building in Park Avenue Baptist Church. So you can see on this photo, it's a really great aerial view, and you can see here's Union Theological Seminary. Clearly this is our church, and here where later the South Wing or the MLK Memorial South Building was erected were actually tennis courts. So we have a lot of really cool images of the tennis courts. There was also an ice skating rink. It was really great. And in a minute, I'll show you the raw excavation photos. They're really awesome. But this is a really great aerial view in the early years of the church. So in terms of the financing, again, I'll go back on February 11th, 1927. There was a public announcement from the building committee that was submitted to the Park Avenue Baptist Church about the financial plan. And so it read, quote, Park Avenue Church sold. So that building that we saw previously, that Gothic building that was sold, and $1,500,000 is the minimum expected to be realized from the sale. One of the members, Rockefeller, has pledged an equal amount and provided the land. So in this announcement, it doesn't explicitly say that it was Rockefeller who did this, but we all know it was, and they all knew it was. But I guess he wanted to formally have some anonymity there. Why, I'm not sure. But it goes on to say, a small group of members have agreed to to guarantee further financing should it be necessary. The Memorial Tower and the Carillon are being gifted by John D. Rockefeller Jr. So there he wants everyone to know that he's gifting that part of the church. There were no canvas for funds for the new building, but some voluntary contributions were received. So this is really showing you that there were a few people very integral in creating and funding our church. It's said that Riverside took $4 million to build, but in reality, Rockefeller invested much more, as during the early years, he contributed gifts when the church was in a deficit as necessary, as I talked about before, essentially bailing us out when we needed it. He also established the endowment, which we all know is still used today. He also funded the building and maintenance of the South Wing, which I talked a little bit about in 1959. So that's where my little laser pointer is here, where the tennis courts were. And then of course, Stone Gym, which cost more millions. So it's believed that in total, Rockefeller gave $32 million to the church, but this is another thing where I've seen in the secondary sources. I haven't delved myself into the primary sources and done the math, so I can't verify that without more extensive research, but I think it's safe to say he gave millions to the church. I think that's a safe assessment. One of these days, I would love to delve into the records and try to get a number, but that's going to take a lot of time. So anyway, during this period, this is the 20s and the 30s, many Protestant churches had been moving their congregations to Upper Manhattan. So once again, we moved uptown. So the plot in particular was chosen because of its proximity to Union Theological Seminary. So again, you can see that right here, which is where Fosdick taught. And then of course, much of Park Avenue Baptist Church's membership already lived in the area. They had been moving uptown this whole time. And the academic centers in Morningside Heights abounded and had a host of students. The architectural style that was chosen by the building committee was Gothic, and the architects Charles Collins and Henry C. Pelton actually took a trip to Europe, which was funded by Rockefeller, to examine the churches and cathedrals throughout history. So Brad says, I have heard the total of Rockefeller's gifts were 32 million. Yep. Thank you, Brad. So as they were touring Europe, they settled on the French Gothic, specifically after Chartres Cathedral. Our next class will be devoted to this topic, and we will have our guest speaker, Mace Anderson, share his expertise on architecture and art. I'm sure a lot of you know Mace. He was a tour guide for many years. He's very knowledgeable about the art and architecture. So I'm excited to have him on board to delve into that. So I'll leave that to him, and I'll just go some more of the building construction. In 1926, children from the junior program of the church school at the Park Avenue Baptist Church discussed what they wanted from their new church. David Rockefeller, the son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., created a scrapbook entitled High Spots, and that captured these discussions. And so there are 3 volumes of these scrapbooks, which are highlights of the archival collection. We actually sort of rediscovered them maybe a year ago. We found this one in a box, on top of a high, the topmost shelf in one of the archive rooms. We had no idea it was there. So it was a great discovery. And so here's just the cover and a little excerpt. Some of the suggestions made by the students include soundproof rooms, don't want to disturb other people. That was by David Rockefeller. Another one was avoid large columns in the church because people cannot see. So that was Edith Harris. So thinking really logistically. Everything will also need to be on a larger scale. So they were thinking about the expanding program. This one is really interesting. I'm not sure how this student Winthrop envisioned this, but he says, quote, "We can have an open air place in summer to play, or even now we could play on a roof. If in tower, it might be a great open space, perhaps with glass to close when necessary. An open floor in the tower with 4 sides open, a nice place to play, the best idea yet, might even give pageants there." So I'm not sure what he was envisioning with a room, a floor in the tower with no walls or windows. Seems a little bit dangerous, but he was thinking about playtime and thinking about pageantry. And so these were the thoughts that were on their minds in 1926. And then someone, Esther, her name is Esther, actually said, "I think a gymnasium would attract more people to Sunday school." So this is really interesting because they're actually thinking of things like pageants, gymnasium. These things actually, spaces in our church actually were created for this. So, these are young students, but they're actually quite knowledgeable about what they might need. And some of these things came to fruition. So that's really interesting. And it's really great that we have this resource. So Karen L, will high spots be digitized in the future and be accessible? It is very interesting. I hope so. So the tricky thing about high spots, so there are 3 volumes and they're very fragile because they're scrapbooks. And so I would love to digitize them, but it's not going to be quite as easy as some of the other materials that we have. And Brad, thank you again, Brad. Winthrop is one of David's brothers. Thanks, Brad. Okay, so let's see. Move the slide. Okay. In April of 1926, some of the boys, including John Richards, Robert G. Knott, Howard Froment, and Jimmy Polk, took a trip up to Riverside Drive with their teacher, Miss Schilling, to see the site and take pictures. And so this is part of the scrapbook. It's really amazing. You can see here Howard and Robert getting ready to go on the trip. And then they've taken some photos here of Claremont. And you can see, I think they're playing baseball, so a group of children playing baseball, which is really fantastic. But you can also see, again, harking back to the question of digitization, you can see on the sides here, and in the next slide, I think, it's very fragile. So, you know, this was put together with glue by some elementary school children. So we really have to be careful in preserving it. These I actually took photos on my phone, so I laid it open. See, you can see the fragility here as well. But they have a bird's eye view of the surroundings of the new church. They mention that these buildings are coming down. This is Grant Park. They mentioned this hall in particular, which you'll see in a later excavation photo. And then they looked at the surrounding neighborhood. We have International House, which was already built, and the Riverside Drive and Hudson River View. So it's really great that these members of the congregation, no matter how young they were involved and interested in the church. Doug Miller has written in the chat, good to hear back that they were including children when they were planning out the church. Absolutely. And again, we would never have known that, that the children were involved in planning if we didn't find this historical document. So again, the ways in which archives can illuminate our history and tell stories that we never would have known. There was no way on earth we would have known that this existed and this happened without this scrapbook. Okay, so Bruce, I'm noticing the time. Is it okay if we keep going? Should we?
Absolutely, yes.
Cool. If everybody else is good with that, I'll just keep going. So let's see. On the chosen plot itself, there were 2 houses and a 12-story apartment building, which you can see here in this slide. So this is the plot. You can see Daycona Hall, which is right here, and that's what the boys mentioned during their trip would be coming down. So if I go back a couple slides, they've actually written it here. So they knew what was coming down as well. Trying to get my cursor. Okay, there we go. So these buildings, of course, had to be torn down and excavated, which is what you see here. This is a construction photograph from 1927. So you can see we're looking at the apartment building as well as Union right across the street. So this is just a really great series of photographs that we have of the construction. Was Grant's tomb built at this time? Yes, it was. It was built at this time. And in a lot of the construction photos, you can see it in the background. It was there, yes. Leonette, do we know where the bird's eye view pictures could have been taken? I'm not sure.
I think they're from an airplane.
From an airplane, sure. Yep.
It wasn't a drone.
No, it was not a drone. We have a number of really beautiful aerial photographs. So yeah, I would just a plane, because at that time they couldn't have been on a really high building looking forward. There was no.
It was a plane.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, So let's see. The cornerstone was actually laid in on Sunday, November 27th, 1927, by Edward Ballard, who was the president of the Board of Trustees. So you can see that here. We have a little excerpt from our church monthly. The Riverside structure becomes a fact. So this is a really nice little photograph capturing that. Now, during construction, however, on the evening of December 21st, 1928, wood scaffolding caught fire in the nave. So I mentioned previously that we have a really bad history with fires. This was probably really horrible because you can see stone tracery was destroyed. The nave was full of water, soaked wood, broken stone. So this is, you can see all of the damage that was done to the nave, which at that time had been extensively constructed. Thankfully, the plaster models of the stone carvings survived. It had taken about 2 years and 5 shops to complete these stone carvings, which we'll see a little bit later. They had actually kept these models, the plaster models, so that they could quickly recreate the carvings. So that was very lucky. If they didn't, they would have had to do it from scratch, and that would have taken a lot of time as well. Insurance apparently covered the damages. Okay. You can see here, this is another one from the exterior. I'm going to use my pointer. You can see the damage on the stone tracery here. It was pretty extensive, all of this here. So of course this delayed, extensively delayed the construction. So while the construction was going on, the Park Avenue Baptist Church building was turned over to the Central Presbyterian congregation in July of 1929. We were not ready for occupancy because of the delay in the fire, and so we had nowhere to worship. So fortunately, the Temple Emmanuel, a Jewish synagogue on 5th Avenue and 76th Street, welcomed the congregation and allowed worship to take place on Sundays. So beginning in October 1929. So therefore we have this gap of July 1929 when Park Avenue was sold and October 1929 when we started to worship in the synagogue, that we had no services. So actually all services were suspended. And then the rest of the activities of the congregation occurred throughout the city in different buildings, but also in parts of the Riverside structure that was completed in the fall 1929 and did not experience damage. So we've got a few things in the chat. I'll just go here. Caroline, I'm curious as to who were living in those apartments that came down and where they were relocated. Emily Anderson, a good point for researching. That is a really good point. I actually don't know. I haven't delved into that research. But that's a really interesting question. That's something we can likely look at in the archives for further detail. And Brad, after the Riverside fire, the city required steel scaffolding. Thank you. That's fascinating. Yeah, so there's that history of wooden structures, wooden scaffolding, and fires. So now we'll just quickly go through some construction photos from the archives. Again, we have a really amazing collection. I digitized these over the summer. That was my COVID activity, working from home, digitizing these wonderful photographs. So you can see we have some here of from 1928. This is September to November, so you can see the progress they make in a short span of time. Let's see. Here is another set of images. We've got February 18th, 1929. You can still see the scaffolding, the tower is being built. This was a little sign that said something along the lines of the Riverside Church This structure will house the Riverside Church pastor, Harry Emerson Fosdick. So it had a little like advertisement of what the building was going to be. And then you can see here in 1930, it's coming more into completion. I like the contrast with the windows. You can see they're sort of boarded up. There's nothing there. And then you can see our stained glass has been put in place. So I'd also like to share these in particular. These actually show the construction workers. So I'm not sure if you can see them. It's a little bit blurry, but here are two of them. Here's another, and yet another. We don't know who they are. We don't have their names, where they were from, where they lived, if they were immigrants, if they were native New Yorkers, but we do have pictures of them. And I think that's important to acknowledge. We've seen the beginning of this class was essentially a listing of the white men who ministered our congregation from the 1840s to the 1930s. Important, of course, but there's the other side of history where we really should take a second to appreciate the lesser known people of whom we have no information about and their roles in our history. So it's true that Rockefeller and Fosdick were visionaries of Riverside, were integral, of course, in building our church. But these were the men who actually built the church. They built it with their hands and their hard labor. And it's really wonderful that at least we have photos of them, even though we don't know anything else about them. Here's another one. You can see this worker right here. Again, he has no name. This time we don't even see his face, but there he is. And to the answer of Grant's tomb, there it is. So this is 1927, so you can see Grant's tomb right there.
In 1927, Grant's tomb was the biggest tourist attraction in the city of New York.
Wow.
More so than the Statue of Liberty.
Wow.
Because that was shortly after the Civil War.
Civil War, right. Yeah.
That was an important consideration in the selection of the site.
Mm-hmm. The traffic, right? Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a really great structure. It's very beautiful. Okay, so one of the things that we do know about of the workers are these gentlemen here. So we have a series of photographs of the creation of the sculptural works, particularly on the chancel in the nave and on the portal, so the entrances, the main entrances and the side entrances. So this photograph actually shows the Pickerelli Brothers in their workshop. They were Italian immigrants from the Bronx and they specialized in sculpture. So here's a case where we know their names, we know where they were from. There's a little bit of history about them. We actually had a documentarian come in maybe about a year ago who was researching them and trying to tell their story on a wider scale. And so we provided them with information, images. So that was really great. It's another lesser known history of Riverside. And so this is really great. These are the actual, the stone sculpture on our chancel. Okay. You can see another one of these men here. He's working on one of the portals. So again, wonderful, wonderful images. And then we have here the architects, and they are standing in front of the stone sculpture and a column capital. So this is one of the columns that were to go in the nave. Okay, so the first service in the nave was October 5th, 1930. And this is the date we use to mark 90 years of history. Again, as the intro to this course has shown, we actually go back to 1841, but this is the date that we use for Riverside, our structure itself. There were over 6,000 people gathered outside of Riverside to try to get in. Of course, you know, our nave does not seat 6,000 people, so it was a crowd. This is a photo from our first service, and this is the bulletin from our first service, say October 5th, 1930. So all the previous bulletins that we have always said the Park Avenue Baptist Church, the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. So this is the first that has the Riverside Church. So the first sermon in Riverside's pulpit was Fosdick's What Matters in Religion, which claimed that nothing matters except those things that create abundant spiritual life. The formal dedication of the church was actually held on February 8th, 1930. And in 1953, Riverside became a member of the New York City Congregational Church Association, while still continuing its affiliation with American Baptist Church. So in 1960, the Congregational Churches united with the Evangelical and Reformed Church to form the United Church of Christ, which Riverside voted to join. So that's just a little background on our affiliations. Again, we're still interdenominational, as you all know, but that's the history of the United Church of Christ affiliation. And we have something from the chat. So Brad, the capitals tell the story of the prophet Jeremiah. Yep, so that is the capitals that I showed you here. And I'm sure Mace, I'm hoping Mace will go through that in the next class when he discusses the art and architecture. He's brilliant. He knows his stuff, so I leave it to him to tell you about that. So now I'd like to just quickly turn to Harry Emerson Fosdick and his life and ministry, and I'll shoot it over to Vince.
Hey, okay. So Harry Emerson Fosdick was born in Buffalo, New York on May 24th, 1878. And after high school, he attended Colgate University, graduating in 1900, then the Colgate Divinity School, then Union Theological Seminary in 1904, and finally Columbia University in 1908. During Fosdick's youth, he was familiar with the more evangelical fire and brimstone style sermons of that time, and he often feared that he himself would be damned to hell as a child. Later on as an adult, he turned away from this view of a frightening God towards one of love and peace, and developed the more liberal Christianity he was known for. Next slide, please. Fosdick was ordained in 1903 at the Madison Avenue Baptist Church in New York. Here's the announcement of his ordination. After graduating from Union Theological Seminary, he became the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Montclair, New Jersey, a position which he held for 11 years. During that time, he also served as an instructor at the Department of Practical Theology in Union Theological Seminary, and later became a full professor there, and was professor there for some time. Next slide, please. During World War I in 1918, Fosdick preached throughout Europe, particularly in Great Britain under the British Ministry of Information and with American troops under the YMCA in France. We have his war diary in the archive, which you can see a little bit of here. During this tour, and because of the atrocities he witnessed, he became a pacifist and later regretted actually having helped support World War I. One of the most famous sermons that was rooted in his pacifism that he delivered later on was The Unknown Soldier, which was given at Riverside in November 12th, 1933 in honor of Veterans Day. After the war, he resumed his work as a professor at Union. He eventually resigned in 1934, but continued on as an adjunct. And he became a professor at the First Presbyterian Church in New York in January of 1919. In the summer of 1921, with the YMCA, he went on several missionary conferences in China and Japan, and in 1924 traveled and preached throughout England and Scotland under the auspices of the Committee on the Interchange of Preachers and Speakers. It's a mouthful. In 1925, he spent 10 months abroad in Egypt and Palestine, which he also chronicled in his diaries and in photos, which are in our collection. Fosdick's ministry at Riverside officially began in 1925 and ended when he retired in 1946. His ministry can be found in his printed sermons, his published books, and his radio broadcasts. He was actually the official voice of NBC's National Vespers Hour from 1928 to 1946 when he retired, I think. He was the voice of the, we have in our collection actually many of the acetate records that contain those sermons. They're in very, very bad shape at this point. They've been around for a long time, and the way these materials work is it's a thin layer of acetate over either glass or metal, and over time they expand and contract with the humidity and the temperature, and all of that thin layer of acetate on the outside just breaks off and becomes these little flakes. So we hope maybe we might be able to recover some of them eventually, but at this time they're really, most of them are in bad shape and are literally, sort of crumbling apart. But we believe that some if not all of the sermons were transferred over to audio tape at some point later on. But these are the original recordings here, which we have almost all of them. Of his radio ministry, Fosdick said, "Whatever the effect of radio preaching may be on the listener, the effect on the preacher is salutary. He is speaking to all kinds of persons from all social, racial, and religious backgrounds there are. Nothing narrows, sectarian, exclusive, and merely partisan will do. He must strike a universal note and deal with elemental human problems. He must be fair, including in his understanding and sympathy, always a human being first and not a partisan. I am profoundly grateful for the opportunity the radio has given me to help others. I am just as grateful for what the radio ministry has done for me." Next slide, please. Fosdick's time at Riverside was marked by his commitment to liberal theology. And because of this, he was very controversial, divisive. Some people labeled him a heretic. His preaching moved beyond literalism and authoritarianism and was thoughtful and compassionate. He asked tough questions in light of modern knowledge and confronted how to live as a Christian in the modern world. His mode of preaching was called the project method, which began sermons with an examination of a real life problem that people faced, and then addressing that problem in terms of the Christian faith. He wanted to not only intellectually stimulate his listeners, but to transform them as well. He once said every sermon should have for its main business the head-on constructive meeting of some problem which was puzzling minds, burdening consciences, distracting lives, and no sermon which so met a real human difficulty with light to throw on it and help to win a victory over it could possibly be futile. He saw preaching as pastoral counseling on a group scale as well, and used modern psychological theory in his work. This is evident in some of his sermon titles, such as Handling Life's Second Bests, The Curse of Cynicism, The Conquest of Fear, and When Life Goes All to Pieces. Fosdick also gave a Wednesday lecture series that were in the same vein, combining modern psychology with Christian beliefs. And throughout his 21 years as senior minister at Riverside, thousands of people came every Sunday to hear him preach. He retired in 1946 and died on October 5th, 1969. I believe actually that MLK considered him one of his favorite preachers and one of the best preachers of the 20th century. Wrote a book. I'm not sure we have it. It would be interesting to find out if we did, but apparently that's known from a dedication that MLK wrote, an autograph that MLK wrote for Fosdick in one of his books. So I bet that book is out there somewhere. I'm not sure we own it, but that would be interesting to find. But yes, MLK had said that he considered him one of the great prophets of the 20th century. So.
Great, thanks. So that's what we have for you today. I know we went over time. Thank you for bearing with us. One of the things I want to mention is we're new to this. We're new to this format. So please let us know if there's anything that could be changed or, could be adjusted for you. Again, hopefully for the next courses, since this was the intro, we kind of just wanted to lay out a kind of basic framework, but in the next ones, we want to have time for discussion. So I know that there's a feature like breakout chats. I don't know, I'm not 100% sure. I'll talk to Bruce about that. But we do want to hear from you. It's great that we hear from you from the group chat. So that's really great. Just let us know any other sort of adjustments that might help to have you more engaged, which again is the point of this. We will give you the primary sources ahead of time. I only gave you 2 days, so I'm sorry about that with the sermon. I hope you were able to read it, but I didn't want to put you guys on the spot and have you discuss if I only gave you 2 days. So just let us know any comments that you have about the format. I see something in the chat I'll just read to everybody. Will we be able to have access to recordings of the class? Yes, Bruce has said we will email out and post the recordings for each class. Penelope has said Fosdick mentions MLK writing that as an inscription in a book. Thank you. Oh, my cursor has disappeared. Okay. Craig says, thanks, it was interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Some interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Is there any way to magnify some of the images that will be helpful? What I can do is also send the PowerPoints. That might be helpful so that you can zoom in on your own and examine the primary sources. Again, everything we're showing you here is from our archive. So we have all those raw files. I'm most interested in the content and in group chat in this course. A lot of the content is news to me. Okay. Thanks, Brad and John, for their insight and knowledge. Yes, thank you. Thank you, yes, to the PowerPoint. I would like to read Fosdick's first sermon at Riverside. Could you send it to us? Yes. So that'll be one of the things that I digitize and I'll send to you. Okay. Does anybody have any other comments or questions? I
have a 2-minute story about the Carillon.
Please,
okay?
Sure.
Everyone knows that John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a big fan of Carillons. And that building on Park Avenue had a Carillon, the forerunner of ours, okay, which had about 50 bells, and our current Carillon has 74 bells. But the little tower on that building on Park Avenue was not big enough to hold all the bells that they had. So they just arranged them on the roof of the building, okay? Mm-hmm. And you couldn't see them from the ground, but they were out there on the roof. But there was a huge problem with that whole Carillon because the building was 9 stories, as you mentioned, but the buildings around it on Park Avenue were 20 stories. So the sound just ricocheted off all the buildings around it. There were articles in the New York Times protesting the racket coming from Mr. Rockefeller's Carillon. So people had no peace and quiet because of his Carillon, which is why when they built the Riverside Church, they built that big tower to put the Carillon in because there were no other buildings around it and they wouldn't have the problem of the ricocheting sound.
That's really great. I didn't know that. That's awesome. And that's another thing I'd like to mention. Thank you, John. And Brad, as we've been going through this, Vince and I, one thing I'd like to emphasize, Vince and I have only been here for a couple of years. A lot of you have been at Riverside for probably longer than I've been alive. So please share your stories. Again, you can reach out to Vince and I. We're always willing to have, you've seen the syllabus now, so if you have anything you'd like to contribute or you want to have like a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute, 5-minute section in the next course to share your knowledge, please do. We invite everybody who has stories or knowledge and expertise to share it with us. Vince and I do not claim to be the experts on Riverside's history. What we know from working in the archives, but we haven't lived it as many of you have. And so we welcome your stories and your additions to our content. Okay, so I think everything, have I answered everything in the chats? Vince, can you take a look for me just real quick? Is there anything I didn't get to? Images, content, okay, inside PowerPoint. So yes to the PowerPoints. Will this be posted online? Yes, Bruce has answered. We will post each class online at the church website. Okay, great. Okay. And the bibliography is ever growing. So I will, like the syllabus, it's tentative and it's flexible. So I can make that available to you, but I will try to continuously add to it as we go through each class. Okay. So I think that's it, unless anybody has anything else they want to say or mention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Very interesting. Very good start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
coming.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.